Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm James Montemagno, and today I'm continuing my series on building your very first Xamarin Forms application for iOS and Android. And today we're going to take a look at configuring your application. In fact, this is the very first thing that I do after I do File New, so tune in. Welcome back, everyone. Today, like I said, we're going to be talking about configuring your Android and iOS applications, the continuation in our series of building your very first Xamarin iOS and Android application with Xamarin Forms. I'm James Montemagno. I'm a PM lead over on the .NET community team at Microsoft, and I love Xamarin development. I've been doing it for over 9 years, and this series is taking you a deep dive through building your very first application, answering your questions, going through every little property that is inside of Visual Studio. So today, I'm going to be talking about configuring your application. And what this means is that there's a lot of settings, a lot of different places that you need to look when it comes to building, deploying, and releasing your application. Sometimes this is the minimum version of iOS or Android that you want to support, different properties like permissions that you need. And also there are a lot of optimizations that you can do inside of your application to make it faster and smaller, which is really awesome because the Xamarin team is always working really hard to do that. Now, if you haven't already, make sure you ding and hit that notification bell when you hit subscribe right down there so you get up to date. And of course, there's another video, which I will link to in the show notes and in that little info bubble over there about creating your very first Xamarin Forms application. It takes you through the whole process. All right, so let's head over to Visual Studio. Now, we started building an application using Xamarin Forms for the user interface and the shell template. And I decided to just recreate that project. We're building out an application together, and it's called My Coffee app. And that's what it looks like over here. Now, we have the main .NET Standard library where we're sharing code. And then we have our iOS and our Android application right here. Now, luckily, inside of the .NET Standard library that we see, there's nothing to configure. It's already done, and it's ready for us to go. These head projects for both Android and iOS, that's where we need to focus and pay attention to our configuration properties. So let's start with Android first, since that's our startup project here. Now, there are a few important things that you want to sort of remember in your mind as far as configuring your application. And the first one is this thing called the Android manifest file. Now, the Android manifest file is really important because when you actually compile your application, Xamarin, it actually combines some different like assembly attributes that you can add for permissions and for different information, but it also combines it automatically in this manifest file. Now, this manifest file describes information about your app, and this is sort of in every single Android application. So we can see here, let's look at the default, what it gives us. It's telling us that, hey, this is the manifest, and we're going to be using Android SDK minimum version 21 and target version 28. And we'll talk about that here in a second. And that's important because that's going to tell Google Play what version of my application it's targeting and how far old, basically, individuals can install my application on. Now, the application node here will have all sorts of different information inside of it, like activities or different broadcast receivers. But it has information such as your label. So you'd want to update this label with information of what you want to be displayed. mycoffeeapp.android is not ideal, so you want to update that. And then also the theme. The theme is really important. It helps describe if it's a light, dark theme, back and forth. And then finally, we can see under the application node, we have uses permission, and it's accessing the network status. And that's one of the default ones here that's brought in. It's important to realize that on Android and iOS, there are different types of permissions that you can request. Some are called runtime permissions, and some are just non-runtime permissions. But runtime permissions are that pop-up box. And on the Android documentation, you can see exactly which ones are and aren't. Access network status is not a pop-up box, and it's just a way of checking to see if I'm online or not. So this is important. In fact, I usually don't spend too much time inside of the Android manifest, but I like to know that it's there so I can configure it. Now, the one place that you do want to do all of your different configuration is by right-clicking on My Coffee App Android and going down to properties down here. Let me zoom in over here so you can kind of see it. But here it is. Alt-Enter will also bring you there, but properties, that's what you want to go to right there. So let me go ahead and right click and go to properties. And that's where we're going to spend a lot of our time inside of Android. Now, notice a few things. First and foremost, I'm in the debug configuration. This is important to know because there's a debug and a release configuration, and they should be different. Let me make that really clear. They should be different. Debug, we sort of skip a lot of compilation steps through that process because we want to have faster builds, and we don't really need to optimize the final output, the package that's going to be built and deployed. So that's really important just to know right there. Is we're just going to use the debug default here. It's pretty much set. I don't think you have to change anything. Some information here, such as use shared runtime and fast deploy. This is a way of installing the Xamarin.net runtime on the device or Android emulator. It makes it so it doesn't have to bundle things and compile things into your app, and it's good to go. This incremental Android packaging, this is an Android packaging step. Check it, you're good to go. You don't need to worry about it. Multi-dex, you'll never really have to worry about unless you have a crazy amount of dependencies and you run into a maximum method issue, and when you do, it'll basically tell you need to enable multi-dex, and it will split that up. Now, for debug purposes, you always want to set this Android package format to APK. That's an Android package, and we'll talk about in release mode why you might need to change that. And then, of course, just leave the default for compiler, code shrinkers. You don't need to do anything. The default is fine. These are both for dexing and code shrinking Java code, and you can leave them blank and the defaults here. Finally, down here in the bottom, we'll see you want to enable debugging. That's important. You also can just leave concurrent garbage collection checked. That's good to go. And you do not want to enable startup tracing. And you don't want to do that because this is a longer compilation step, and you're not going to see anything specific for your debug app. Now, finally, down here, what you'll want to do is always ensure in debug linking is set to none. This actually applies for both iOS and Android. And what linking is a way of telling the compiler for iOS and Android to sort of how much code in the .NET runtime to remove. And it's really smart because you don't want to include all of .NET into your application. So it sort of tree shakes, it sort of removes and strips away and looks at your code to say what's required and what's not. But for debug purposes, we don't want to do that because it'll take longer, in general. And that's kind of good. There is this advanced button here. This advanced button will bring up this screen. And again, you can mostly leave the defaults here for debug. Supported architectures that we see here are important. The Android emulators are x86, so you will definitely want to add those on there. There's also ARM 64-bit support that you can have. That's one thing that you'll want to have, and it's required if you ship your application to Google Play. All of these other ones you can mostly ignore. I rarely have to set these unless they are just a crazy amount of dependencies in my app. For HTTP, the defaults are what you want. Android and the default TLS 1.2, these are the latest and greatest. The templates set you up for this stuff for success, really. And you can walk through and change these if you need to. But again, they're pretty smart for what you need by default. If I go into here, there's managed and legacy, but you sort of want to use the default. It uses the latest SSL, the latest TSL. Only if for some reason you have certs and you need to go back in time and need to require them, then you'd want to change that. Now, I like to come in and change my defaults immediately for release in all my applications because I don't want to forget to do that step. So up here, you can toggle it between debug and release. So here's release here. And when you toggle to release, you'll see some things changed in this. So the first thing that you'll want to note is that use share runtime is off. You cannot deploy and ship your application with that on, so that must be turned off. Incremental Android APPT2, that's on. Now down here, Android package, you can select APK or bundle, Android app bundles. If you're using a service like Visual Studio App Center or Azure DevOps or another CI service, most of them provide support to give you both APK and App Bundle. You can keep it simple at APK. However, I highly recommend toggling on and using Android app bundles and letting Google Play sign your application. This is going to drastically reduce your Android application size, nearly up to 50%. It enables smart distribution across all of the different Android devices. Code shrinkers D8 and R8 are there. You can leave the default. I like to turn on R8 as well. Those two map together. I like to turn off developer instrumentation debugging. You don't need that. And then a few things down here, enable startup tracing. Startup tracing is a really cool option that enables decreased startup time, and it only sort of has very minimal cost on the size of your application. Sort of the team has built a sort of a small ahead of time compiled initialization of your application for Android, and it really reduces startup time, which is great. And then finally down here, you're going to see SDK assemblies only in the linker. There are 3 settings: none, that's for debug; SDK assembly only; and SDK and user assemblies. By default, I highly recommend only selecting SDK assemblies only. This is the same for iOS. There are these 3 settings for iOS as well. You want to always ensure by default SDK assemblies only. This will only look at the .NET SDKs. It's not going to look at your code or the other dependencies that you may have. If you want to go further and you want to actually reduce your application size even further, you can do SDK and user assemblies, but the linker is only so smart. So sometimes when different packages are using reflection or have different requirements, you can run into issues. So you really want to test your application in all scenarios there. I have a great article that I'll put in the show notes below that walks you through how to really test and optimize in using SDK and user assemblies. But I like SDK assemblies by default. All right. The last thing here that you have is advanced. And again, you're going to see a few differences here, mostly around the supported architectures. So you need to make this decision. I always support ARM v7a and ARM64 v8a, and I leave everything else alone, unless for some reason my application doesn't compile inside of here. These are advanced options. I'll link to some documentation for them. And again, Android HTTP, default, these are the good stuff. It's all been optimized. It's good to go. Now you may be wondering, well, should I go in and select other things like x86 and x86 64-bit? Well, if you're using Android app bundles, sure, why not? It's just going to create a little bit bigger of a package, but it will be distributed correctly and it won't increase the application size. Now, there's not that many x86 Android devices, so you kind of can choose your balance there as if you want to have another test matrix. So usually most people turn that off because nearly all Android devices are just ARM devices. All right, so that is the settings for debug and release, and I like to save those. And I like to just toggle those really quick, make sure like I'm good to go and I'm really happy with them. The other part here is that you can also click on Android Manifest right inside the property pane, and that's going to show you a representation as best as it can of most of the properties in that Android Manifest. So we see things like the application name, the package name, the theme, we saw this earlier, version number, installed, prefer internal, that's usually what I do. And then down here, we have our required permissions that we saw, oops. And let me zoom in one more time, required permissions, there we go. And also that minimum and the target Android version, okay? Now, these are really important to know because this is saying this minimum Android version is how far back am I going to allow people to install my application. This target Android version is not saying only allow people up to this version to install the application. That's the only thing that minimum does, says, hey, anyone from 5.0 forward can install my application. Target Android version says, this is what I compiled my application against. This is what I sort of is like the APIs that I've used. And Google Play is really smart and Android is really smart. It can use this information. So if newer features come out, it won't automatically enable those inside of your application until you're ready. Now, this target version number here that we see, there's a lot of them here. What I recommend doing is always matching the target Android version with something called the compile version. And under application, we can see specifically that there is this compile using Android version, target framework. Super important here. And when you're starting your new application, I almost highly recommend nowadays at least compiling against 10 or 11. The default templates still do 9, but for Google Play, they are starting to require 10 or 11. So here you can actually change this. Let me go ahead and change it. And if you don't have the SDK installed, there'll be an asterisk there and it'll ask to prompt to download the SDK. Here I'm going to say, yes, I want to go ahead and change this. It's going to reload sort of my application. It's quite a large change. There we go. And now under application, we'll see Android 11. In my Android manifest, we're going to note that it's really smart. It actually automatically upgraded the Android target version here automatically to Android 11 for me, which is very, very nice. Those numbers should basically always match. Now, what I just told Android though, is that I have tested and I am sure that any of those new APIs that Google introduced in Android 11 are totally compatible with my application. So you really want to make sure that you just don't, willy-nilly just change this setting, that you actually pay a little bit of attention to what is new in Android, because you are telling Google Play and the Android operating system that, hey, I've checked my code. It is all good to go. Okay. All right. The last few things to talk about here, we talked about Android options. There's also Android package signing. If you want to, if you're building an APK, you can throw your key store, your alias, you can throw stuff in here, although you probably won't because you'll use something such as a CI service like Azure DevOps or App Center or Bitrise or some other service there too. So you probably want to just use that. Everything else in here, you can basically ignore. The build events, reference paths. These are just defaults for Visual Studio projects. So that's really what you need to know. Everything else over here, like I said, is over here. The Android manifest is here. Information like the assembly information is here too. You can see that actually, funnily enough, that inside this Android manifest, 2 different permissions were added here. This is something that's really, really neat because when I compile this application, it will take these assembly imports and compile them into a final version here of my Android manifest. It'll take that information and any other information such as this activity here that will show me, will be bundled automatically into the Android manifest. It's a really cool thing. So I just built it, and here I can actually say open folder. Here I'm going to say obj debug Android 11. Here is the Android manifest. Let me open this in code. And then here we're going to see that this is the final one that's actually built for debug. So there's a lot more in here, but you can actually see that here's the activity that I have, the main launcher. Here's all of those permissions for me automatically. And it puts in a few different debug spots that need to go in there. So it's something to be aware of if you're like, hey, what does my final Android manifest look for? It's in the obj, debug, or release, and then the version number that you compiled against. So that's important to know where that is at in case you ever need to really dive down in there. Now that is Android. So let's hop on over to iOS. Of course, I'll put links in the bottom here, so maybe you've already skipped ahead here to iOS to easily come back. But iOS is going to be relatively similar. So let me go ahead and jump in here, and I want to show you a few things. That there's a few important files for iOS. First is the info plist here and the entitlements plist. The info plist is very similar to the Android manifest. It describes the application at a higher level than Android, but it has important information in there. And then the entitlements we'll talk about here too, but entitlements are a little bit further of a scenario. So if you need to use like HealthKit or you need to use push notifications, entitlements are something that you're negotiating with the Apple App Store that are there. Now, there's really not too much else you need to know. There's different images that you can put in resources and asset catalogs. But for most different settings, you can just go right click and go to properties on iOS like we did for Android. And notice over here that there are a lot of different iOS settings. So let's go through them one by one over here. First is iOS build. This is where we're going to spend the vast majority of our time. All right, for debug, you don't need to change anything really, to be honest with you. Any of this stuff like SDK default here, when you're compiling your final application, this will just choose whatever is installed instead of the default on your machine. If you're on Visual Studio for Mac, you can select a specific SDK version if you have multiple installed, but you're basically on iOS always compiling against the version of Xcode that's installed on your machine. Linker behavior, I said very similar before that this is exactly the same as Android. So for debug, like we have up here, don't link. That'll be super quick. For supported architectures over here, ARM64 is just fine. If you're going to a iOS simulator, there's another option inside of here that you can add on. I think it's actually in there by default for ARM64, so you're good. HTTP implementation, again, you can just use the default NSURL. That's the newest one. And then pretty much everything else you just leave as the default. Enabling the mono interpreter enables iOS hot restart to be enabled. That's only for debug. And all these other settings are just optimization. So 64-bit optimization, debugging optimizations, concurrent garbage collection, implementations. If you are deploying to a iOS device, like you're plugging it in and doing full compiles on Visual Studio for Mac or connecting to your Mac, you can enable these ones, incremental build and device specific builds. So instead of compiling a specific ARM version, you can have it optimized and only do one by default. But ARM64 is a good one. That's the latest and greatest for supported architectures that almost everything has. Now over for release, there's going to be some different settings over here. Again, we're going to, let me zoom in here. We're going to use the default SDK. That's fine. This link frameworks SDK only, just do that. Link all would be user code and the framework, but this one's good. Supported architectures, this is a tricky one. You want to select how far back you need to go. So you always need ARM64 because that's the latest and greatest. It's going to make the best optimized code for you. ARM v7, ARM v7s, or all of them combined, those are going to have some different implications. I feel like you need to go all the way back to a very, very old iPhone or very, very old iPad that's not ARM64 based. However, I would recommend just ARM64. That's going to give you the smallest build, things like that. Again, HTTP client, NSURL, that's the latest and greatest with TLS. Then, surprisingly, this isn't checked by default, but I always highly recommend it because the LLVM optimizer and compiler creates faster and smaller code, but it takes a lot longer to compile. Okay, so this is for your App Store builds. Those are the things you want to do. And then additionally here, if you are doing ARM v7 or ARM v7s, you can check this checkbox for thumb to instructions. Now, on Android, if you have Visual Studio Enterprise, there's actually a few more checkboxes there for AOT and LLVM. I don't recommend doing them. Just use startup tracing and you're good to go. For iOS, applications are already ahead of time compiled, so you definitely want to use this stuff. And then the rest of the defaults are fine. LLVM optimizing, good. 32-bit operations to 64-bit, awesome. Strip native debugging, concurrent garbage collection, good. These two flags don't matter because you're not debugging. You're fine. You're good. All right. Now that's pretty much all you really need to know. You can also do this optimize PNGs, and that will optimize your PNGs as well. If you have a lot of different files, you might want to look into packaging there. Under debug, only when you're in debug, you can enable debugging. There is also something called debug over Wi-Fi. That's really nifty if you're on Visual Studio for Mac, where you can debug once and disconnect it and walk around if you're doing geolocation. That's pretty nifty. iOS on-demand resources. There's really nothing else to do there unless you're doing on-demand resources. I never have, so probably don't need to unless you're building a game. Bundle signing. This only really matters when you're deploying to device for testing or your final builds. You'd want to come in, do different provisioning, select your team, select your different information there. The iOS IPA settings, again, this isn't really super important unless you need an IPA archive, but when you build and compile, it will automatically do stuff for you. Manifest files, we'll come back to that. And again, iOS run configurations, you can change this to debug or background fetch and do different touch arguments, advanced scenarios. Wouldn't worry about them right now. Let's talk about configuration. The configuration for the iOS manifest is very similar to the Android manifest, except for here, I can just simply click on this button and open a visual view of the info plist. So if I go ahead and close all of these here, and I just double click on the info plist over here, it comes up over here. And this stuff's really important. Here's the application name, what's going to be displayed, my bundle identifier, that's what I've registered over on iOS, a version number, you probably want to put 1 there. And then here's deployment target. This is a similarly important version to set. Deployment target is the minimum version of iOS that you want your users to use. So you could change this to 10, to 11, etc. So for example, I might put 11.0 because I only want people with iOS 11 and above to install my app. Main interface, we don't have storyboards or anything like that, so we can just leave the default. And then there's devices. Normally, everybody sets them to universal. This means that your application will be compatible with both iPadOS and iOS. If you make this iPad or iPhone only, then on the App Store, users will have to, can only install those on those devices. But be known that even if you select iPhone and iPod here, that users on iPad can still install your app, but they get a 2x zoom button. It's a terrible experience. So it's much better to always do universal. Then down here, you can control the device orientation of your application. So portrait, landscape, left. So if you don't want your users to rotate to your device, you can check or uncheck that. Here, there's other things such as requiring full screen if you're a game, if it needs to support multi-windows if you're on iPadOS, or hide the status bar. There's some additional other things such as visual assets for like app icons, accent colors, launch screens. Those are already configured for you. Capabilities if you're using Game Center, maps, background modes, and then advanced for different document types, UTIs, URLs, and things like that. This is where you're going to find those settings. Now, one thing that's not exposed in here that I like to do is just say open with, and I can open it with the XML editor here. And this XML editor is going to give me that same exact view like I saw for Android Manifest. This is going to enable me to really kind of dive in and see what is inside of here. So here's the different modes for iPad. Actually, we see that there's all modes are supported, the minimum OS version. This is important, the display, and also different information like my bundle name. So I may want to change those if I want to down the road. Most of them are displayed in the UI, but some of them aren't, such as adjusting the different permissions as well. So that's something that's there. You can see it in XML form. You can also say open with and say iOS entitlements editor, and that will open up the entitlements editor. Let me see that again. Generic plist editor. That's what it is. And this will give you sort of a different drop down. There's kind of like 3 different views for this. But you can see here there's settings and bundles and keys, and you can see a different visual tree. This is similar to Xcode here. And I could add a new setting here. I could double tap on this, and I could select, for example, permission over here. Let's see if there's like launch images, localization, privacy. So if I needed calendars, for example, I could then add a string, and then I could say, I need calendar permissions. There we go. For example, that's a terrible string. Don't use that. But that's another view that you can use for the info plist. Okay, so you can double click it. And when you double click it, you get this nice visual tree with visual assets, capabilities. You can right click, open with, generic plist editor. You get this view, or you can right click, open with, and when you need to, just say XML, and boom, there's my XML. I get everything I need. So you can do that. Now, when you double click on the entitlements.plist, this is going to bring up all of the different information for the entitlements. So if you're inside of the Apple portal, you can register. So if you need things like Siri or iCloud or HomeKit or sign in with Apple, you're going to configure those here. So you can tap on it. You can enable this inside of your entitlements.plist. You can have different ones for debug versus non-debug. So when you go back into your iOS properties and go into your bundle signing here, you can have different custom entitlements right here inside of this user interface. So you can have it there. Okay. So that's pretty much all you need to know for iOS when it comes to the different properties, some things that you may want to adjust and change based on active, debug, or release mode. Again, most of the defaults are super good, but again, you definitely want to read through some documentation, which I'll link below. You can always hover over things like I'm doing here, get a little bit of information, but hopefully this gave you a really good walkthrough of just sort of setting up your different application, making sure you have the right defaults so you're set up for success from the beginning and you're sort of ready to go. It only takes a few seconds, but the settings I showed you are going to enable you to get the fastest code, fastest app, and the smallest bundle at the end of the day. Now, everyone's preferences are different based on where and what devices you need to deploy your application to. But again, hopefully this was a good walkthrough of building your iOS and Android application. In the next video, now that we've set everything up, I'm going to be talking about updating, configuring our NuGet packages. So you definitely want to check into that. So make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you get notification bell right there to make sure you get all the notifications of every new episode that's come out. And of course, don't forget the last episode, which I'll put in the show notes in case you miss it, which was sort of that walkthrough of the very first file new, what is what, where do you want to go? And I'm going to continue this journey of my coffee app here, building it out now that we've configured it. Next, we're going to update our NuGet packages and start building our application, learning about all the great things that Xamarin and Xamarin Forms and Xamarin Essentials have to offer. So I hope you really enjoyed this video. Give it a thumbs up if you did and share it with your friends. I really appreciate that. And don't forget that I live code on Fridays over on twitch.tv/James Montemagno. Thanks again for tuning in. I really appreciate it and have a great day.